Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a few more minutes and wait for everyone else to trickle in. Stay tuned.
Can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay.
I'm assuming the screen is still the same. It's just the three of us on your end.
Yes.
There's the bells.
This microphone brings in everything in the house,
So just to fill everyone else in, Susan has a cat that apparently likes to hunt for birds. And so this cat now has 3 bells on it and is walking around the house. So the ringing you hear in the background is Susan's cat, and she might visit this meeting as well. I would say maybe we'll wait till about 11:33 before we get started. Hi, Brownie.
There's the killer.
The mandatory animal visit at a virtual meeting. All right, it's 11:33. I will say we get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Sacramento Valley, California Urban Forest Council first Learn at Lunch of 2021. My name is Julia Gowan. I'm the Regional Urban Forester for Northern California and the Sacramento Valley for CAL FIRE, and I will facilitate today's event. And with me is Ann Finkner. Like everyone else in the days of COVID, we're using a new platform. And with this new platform, we also get to have speakers we otherwise wouldn't get, in addition to having a wider audience. Today's speaker and the speaker of our next event are international, which is super exciting. We will try to keep the schedule similar to our previous in-person of every other month, so check the website. But just as a heads up, on March 18th, we are fortunate to have Cecil Knijndijk join us from Barcelona. He will be talking about urban forestry and climate change, and in May, we have our own Jimmy Scheidt to talk about land management and wildfire. So this new virtual platform, of course, also gave us issues right away in that our speaker, Susan Day, is not actually able to share her screen and be a host for reasons unknown to us. So she is joining in the meeting, but I will actually advance her slide and be her mouse. So bear with us as we manage the system. I will also monitor the chat for questions with help by Ann Finkner, so don't hold back on any questions. Susan asked me to interrupt her with questions, but she'll also incorporate breaks in her presentation, so hopefully one way or another we'll answer all the questions you might have. So today's speaker is Dr. Susan Day. Susan is a professor of urban forestry in the Department of Forest Resources Management and the program director for the urban forestry degree at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Susan's research focuses on managing urban soils to enhance tree growth and longevity in the context of environmental challenges, such as stormwater mitigation and land development impacts on soil-mediated ecosystem services. She helped shape the soils matrix for the Sustainable Sites Initiative International Accrediting System for the Sustainable Design Projects, and developed soil profile rebuilding, a rehabilitation technique to restore damaged urban soils in situ and enhance urban soil carbon storage. Her research in the water relations of tree-engineered soil systems in partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Trust has informed stormwater policy in the Chesapeake Bay region of the United States. Susan is also currently a partner in the Los Angeles Healthy Trees, Healthy Communities initiative. She has published more than 130 articles and book chapters on urban forests and urban soils, and is the 2017 recipient of the L.C. Chadwick Award for Arboricultural Research. Susan holds a BA from Yale University, an MS from Cornell University, and a Ph.D. from Virginia Tech. I'm really excited for Susan to be here today. Besides the wealth of experience and knowledge that she will share with us, she's also my former PhD advisor and mentor, without whom I would have never made it through grad school. So I'm super excited that she's here today. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself, share my screen, turn off my camera, and hand over the microphone to Susan. Susan, is there any way that Brownie could leave the room? Because it seems on my end, at least, the ringing is rather loud.
I'm actually holding his bells.
Oh.
So I don't think it's Brownie.
Okay, maybe it's some other background sounds here.
Hopefully it'll go away.
Okay, hopefully your screen is up now. Oh, I'm not seeing your screen. Well, this is interesting.
Actually, I see presenter mode, Julia, and it has all kinds of notes that are totally irrelevant to this presentation. So I want to make sure that the notes don't show.
That is interesting. Okay, so if
you could try the PDF. The PDF.
Bear with us, everyone, as we are hopefully trying to get through the technical difficulties of this morning. Hold on here. Okay, I'm just going to close everything else off in the background. Let's try this again. Is your presentation on the screen now?
I see a blank. I see your desktop background.
Okay.
And now I see the PowerPoint, and I see presenter mode again. So I think you better go with the PDF, Julia.
Okay. I don't know. Oh, hold on. I have another idea.
It's treating the webinar as your primary screen.
Yeah, but I can flip the two around.
If you could make it so it clones the screens or something, yeah, or flip it around. So just for everyone who's listening, just some apologies, because you might think we didn't do a dry run, but we did. We actually did a dry run on the system, but it doesn't allow you to start the webinar. Once you start it, you have to keep it going. So we can't fully experiment with the system. That looks good. I think I see it.
Beautiful. Wonderful. I apologize for this. Hopefully everything else will go smoothly. Susan, take it away.
Okay. So so good afternoon, or I guess good middle of the day to everyone. And thanks for inviting me to the lunch and learn session you have. I kind of envisioned, 15 or 20 people sitting around a table with their cups of coffee and sandwiches and just sort of chatting about soils. But in the virtual context, it all gets changed around. But I do kind of want to keep that sort of atmosphere. And I've asked Julia if you have something you want to put in the chat, whether it's a comment or a question, Julia will be watching all those comments, and she will just break right into the discussion and bring up anything that needs bringing up. So if there's something you're wondering about, or like a slightly different topic, just feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat as we go along, so we can make this a little more interactive. I'm just because of some technical problem that I can't join in as a host. I have kind of limited availability. I can't see the chat or anything. So so we'll just start. Okay, so Julia, advance. All right, so what I did was I made sort of 3 kind of mini talks, because today I really wanted to talk to you about how I approach looking at urban soils. You know, how do we sort of decide what to do? Lots of times people ask me questions like, they say, well, you know, how many bulk density tests should I take? Or, you know, where should I do, you know, how many soil texture tests do I need to make? Or what depth do I measure this? Or how far should this be? Or, you know, all these kinds of questions. And I really think that there's almost like an art to looking at a site and starting to really understand what's going on with the soils there. And so that's really what I want to share with you today, because there's no cut and dried answer to those kinds of questions. The answer is always, it depends, you know. And so what you really need to do when you're thinking about soils, in my mind, is that you have to have this kind of 3-dimensional picture in your mind about like what, you know, what's going on. It's at depth, what's going on as you move across the land. And then you have to really think about how trees interact with it. And so since this is the Urban Forest Council, I'm just assuming that you're all interested in growing trees in your soil. So, so I broke it into 3 parts. One is just kind of thinking about soils and how we look at them. Then I want to have a section to specifically talk about how roots experience and interact with compacted soil. That's actually an area, a research interest of mine for a long time. I did my both my master's and PhD work focused on that, and I've been focusing on this for a long time. So I'm very interested in this subject, and I want to talk briefly about that. And then some decision making. So how we decide to make decisions about remediating compacted soil. And I will talk a little bit about soil profile rebuilding that Julia mentioned. And so I'm going to focus primarily on physical properties in soils, but the same kinds of things apply to, you know, metal contamination or chemical properties and things like that. So just jump in if you have a question anytime. It's totally fine. So Julia, go ahead and advance. So post questions in the chat. Julia is going to jump in if needed, and then between each section, we'll take a Q&A break. We can go, you know, then we can start eating our sandwiches maybe and just take some questions. Advance. Okay, so the first section is partly about, you know, why we care about soils, like why they matter, and then sort of looking at it as kind of a how we approach understanding what's going on below ground. You know, that's the part of the ecosystem that we can't see. So how do we do that and advance? So this slide is really, you know, these things are ecosystem services that you're all really familiar with. I mean, so we expect cities to provide all kinds of ecosystem services through their trees and soils. And it's not just the trees, it's the trees and the soils. So they're supposed to improve public health. They you know, improve the relationship with the broader ecosystem. They can avoid carbon emissions through, you know, reducing energy use. It can help water quality and so forth. Advance. And so a lot of cities like Barcelona, and I just pulled this picture of Barcelona's green infrastructure plan, but almost every city in recent years has a plan like this, Advance. And what they're trying to do with these plans is they're getting much more sophisticated than they were a few years ago. So it used to be that, you know, you would say, oh, well, our plan is to increase our tree canopy by X% or something. But now many cities have these really quite sophisticated plans targeting specific ecosystem services that they want to manage. And so this means that we have to have more detailed information about everything in this system in order to manage it for these specific needs. Advance. And one of those really critical things is soils, okay? And Of course, I'm, completely biased because I love soils, and not everybody does, but I view soils as really the foundation of this. I mean, you think about projects that you do, like let's say you're painting, well, if you don't do good prep work and sanding and priming the surface, then all your work in painting is just wasted. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but you paint something and then 3 months later all the paint's peeling off, right? You have to start all over again. Or let's say you're building a building and you don't have the proper soil foundation or the proper foundation for the building, and then the building becomes unstable and cracks and falls down. I mean, this is really the role that soils play in our urban ecosystems. And it's like, if we don't have the soil right, everything else doesn't work, and you'll just be sort of paying the price over time. So I think that in any project you have, really paying attention to what's in the soil now, and does it need to be managed or changed, or what's its status, and what are the options here, are absolutely critical. Advance. And the other thing is, this is a Persian Perodia. This is in Vancouver. So I'm just looking at the leaf. And one of the things that I do, and I'm sure everyone in this seminar also does this as well, is everywhere I go, I'm always looking at the trees. I wonder what's wrong with this tree, or why does it look stunted, or why is it growing well? And what we're really looking at is how trees are interacting with their environment. And the biggest, or perhaps the most consequential component of that environment is many times the soil, right? Or like in this case, lack of soil. There just simply isn't enough soil. And so I mention that because all these things I'm going to talk to you about today are really things you can also use just for problem diagnosis, not just planning or establishing or managing, new and existing landscapes or trees, but also just kind of diagnosing things. Advance. And this interaction is really, really stark. And this is something that and I'm talking about the interaction between soils and trees specifically. And this is something that we've all seen. You see grandiose plans for some new streetscape, and the trees and the pictures look all, big and beautiful, but they're not going to look like that if the soil isn't there to support them. And this is a picture that's actually from the Indianapolis Museum of Art, which is now called Newfields. But if you see that sort of gray stripe there on the left in the turf, that is a change in the soil depth. Okay, so considering the turf as the plant in question here, you get a completely different outcome from having one soil depth versus another soil depth. And this is sort of an interesting landscape because this entire thing is actually a green roof. It's at ground level, but it's above the parking garage. And this is all like permatil, lightweight media on the surface, and those trees are anchored down with chains and all kinds of interesting things. Advance. And so this is one of the beautiful trees from the remarkable trees of Virginia. It's a cucumber tree. And I just put this here because I think it's good. We spend a lot of time, or at least I do, because I work in cities and in kind of the denser portions of cities in many cases. We see a lot of trees that are small or new or sort of medium sized, and that's successful. But a really mature tree, I mean, this is what it looks like, right? A big, sprawling, really complex environment, and ecologically really, really rich environment. And so I also think when we look at soils, we shouldn't think small. We should think, wow, is it possible to create a place where an organism like this can exist in our cities? Advance. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures that just explain this interaction, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but genotype times environment equals phenotype. So essentially, the genetics of our plant interact with the environment, and they give us a certain outcome. Advance. And so if we have a red maple, and then we have an environment of compacted soil like this, then this is what we're going to get. So this red maple on the right is, it's more than 25 years old. I mean, it's almost like in suspended animation. It never grows, okay? And that's what you're going to get, okay, because of the soil conditions advance. And so this is a southern magnolia here on the right. Don't expect to get this thing on the right if you're going to have southern magnolia times that same environment. You're not going to get anything like that, right? So we need to not fool ourselves about this advance. And we all know the problems with urban soils. So soils are compacted. This is a building site. You can see how compacted that soil is. This is now a row of Zelkova trees that were planted there. You know, we have confined soils. We sometimes have pH issues. It sort of depends on your region. Here in Vancouver, the soils are relatively acid. There's a lot of granite around. We really don't have problems with elevated pH. In other parts of the country, we have limestone bedrock, limestone gravel in use, and soils with where the pH can become much more elevated, and then you can have pH problems. You might have contamination. You might have organic matter cycling issues. But I'm going to focus a lot on compaction today, but some of these things are you know, more universal, advance. Okay, so because we all know how bad urban soils can get, another issue that comes up is that people just say, well, it's urban and degraded, it's no good, let's get rid of it, let's just make something better and bring it in. Okay, and this is me, that's a picture of me, and I'm holding this sign at a conference, and so we had breakout rooms, and I was put in the urban and degraded room, and it just kind of cracked me up. Okay, advance. So these manufactured, blended, and engineered soils, there's different kinds and for different purposes, and I won't go into them in detail, but one thing I do want to point out that is increasingly a trend, especially in some regions, this is certainly dominant in Vancouver, but is using blended soils, and that's what's stockpiled here. This is essentially piles of sand that have been mixed with compost, and often to very exacting specifications. And then this soil is brought in as sort of a replacement for native soil. And so in this particular project, you know, surface soil could be scraped away, and then this was replaced with this. And that creates its own kind of problem. And when you're trying to investigate a site, this is the kind of thing you need to know. Like, is it likely that someone has done this in the past? Can you ascertain that? Advance. So this next picture, whoops, advance again. That's just a close-up. You can see how sandy it is. I forgot there was an animation on that one. Okay, so this next picture is the University of British Columbia campus, or part of it. And actually, all the soils that you see in this picture, most of them are not native soils, or they're not the sort of natural existing soil. A lot of it is imported and brought in for specific purposes. So in some cases, the use of those soils can be really prevalent, and that's something you need to be aware of when we get to the next part. Okay, keep going. Advance. And I show this picture. Whoop, go back. All right, so I'm showing this. These are two soil pits that are about 6 feet apart in North Florida. And the reason I'm showing you this picture is I just want to really emphasize the dramatic effect that soil management and our activities on the surface affect soil. So on the right is where they've been growing they've had a community garden for about 5 or 6 years in this case, and on the left was right next to it where they didn't have a community garden. And you can just see the difference in the organic layer and so forth. So what we do to the soil has a really profound effect, and sometimes quite quickly. Advance. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about being a below ground detective, and for some reason the word detective got lost there. But so this is really how I approach looking at a site. So if I'm going to go and diagnose a problem, or maybe plan a planting, or consider, what mitigation is needed if there's going to be construction in the area or something on a site, the first thing I do is really start to familiarize myself with the site and kind of develop a strategy for how to approach it and what I need to learn about the site. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and so before I get into that, any questions, Julia? Anything coming through on the chat?
No, not yet. You're perfectly clear.
Okay. All right. Well, now we're getting into the meat, so maybe there'll be some questions. Okay, advance. All right, so when we look at a site, there are 3 different scales where we can assess the soils. All right, so there's sort of the scale where we might have information from soil maps. Okay, so that would be a larger scale. Then there's things that have to do with sort of the parcel, or maybe even like a community. Those would be things like grading, or changes in the topography, or past site use. And then the smallest scale is really, what's going on with this soil right here, like it might be down at the tree level, okay, or a garden. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those. Advance. So soil surveys, this is the Web Soil Survey, and I actually have a screenshot here of the city of Los Angeles, which, unlike most cities, has an urban soil survey. In fact, they probably have the most advanced urban soil survey anywhere. It's pretty recently been completed. The data there are just amazing. It's really been quite an amazing effort by the USDA and others. But even if you don't have an urban soil survey, there's a lot you can learn from the soil survey map, but you can't learn everything, right? And so sometimes you have sort of 2 extremes the way people look at this. They think, oh, I'll just look at the soil survey. That answers my question about this site. I don't need to do anything else. That's completely wrong, okay? Or you might have someone say, oh, it's urban, the soil survey is totally useless. I don't need anything. So really the best way to approach it is a hybrid of those. And you can use the soil survey as a way to think about what's happened in the past on a piece of land. And because the key to understanding soils is land use history. So if you go into a piece of soil survey like this, you define an area of interest, and then you can zoom in, you can look at the map. On the left, where it says like urban land, aqua, all that stuff there, those are different soils that are on the map, and you can click on them and you can find more information. You can look up the soil series. Okay, so in many cases, what you typically find in a city is that there will be something, it'll say something like urban land complex, Poplamento, or the name of some soil series. And generally what that means is, well, it used to be Poplamento, and now we've disturbed it and it's become this sort of urban land complex. But that tells you that that's what used to be there, right? And so you can look up that soil survey and soil series, which is the name of an individual soil. For those of you who aren't familiar with soil taxonomy, you can look it up on the official soil series database, and it will tell you all kinds of things about what's typical of that soil. So it might tell you, the soil texture at various horizons, whether it's acid or basic. It'll tell you things like the depth to water table, and these things all matter. So even if we go in and we scrape away the topsoil for building and compact the subsoil and maybe put fill on, or all kinds of things, those fundamental characteristics, a lot of them will still exist, right? You'll still have the same kind of subsoil, soil texture, for example. You might have the same kind of soil chemical characteristics. You might have the same water table height, unless you have an additional water table from creating like a compacted area near the surface, right? So, and in fact, there's been research looking at this, looking at the characteristics of urban soils and the characteristics of the soils that used to be there. And the soils that were originally there before disturbance, they continue to exert a really strong influence on the soil. So step one is to really understand what was there and what can you learn about that. Okay, so advance. So the next part is the thinking of the soil as this three-dimensional thing. Okay, so it has layers, right? It has these horizons. And so you need to just kind of look around you and read the land, okay? And that's what I call it. It's like really look around. What do you think has happened here? So in this particular picture, you see a couple of things. So I want to know, maybe people can put in the chat, like, what do you observe looking at this picture? Like, what do you think is going on here? And Julie, just go ahead and report what people say. Someone's got to go put something in the chat. Any kind of observation, no matter how trivial, go ahead and put it in.
We don't have anything yet. I might call out people just randomly by name, but what I see is there's water. It doesn't drain, or at least hasn't yet.
All right. I did see a chat. I saw
What?
Soggy soil, someone said.
Why am I not seeing the chat?
I don't know. I just saw one. I saw soggy soil. It flashed by and then it disappeared.
Interesting. I see recently disrupted from someone, but it's not coming up in the chat for me. This is really weird. Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about the first thing that someone noticed, though. There's surface water there, right? And this person, who is actually my husband, is holding a little stick, which he has stuck in the ground. And you can see that the depth of this sort of topsoil here is just a couple of inches, and there's surface water. Okay, so we see that. What else do we see? Look big picture.
Okay, so apparently there, oh boy, what is going on my screen here?
I saw a little heart fly up. Someone liked something.
I don't know what's
there's
going on
another
my
heart.
screen here. But so we have, apparently I didn't realize there's two different ways to share information in the chat, and apparently there's a questions box, which didn't show up on my end. So we have apparently lots of questions about logistics. So hold on a second.
I think
Okay.
the slide went back, Julia.
Yeah, that
Need to
too.
advance back up.
Okay. All right, so we have some kind of compacted subsoil layer, heavy equipment being driven over, too fine, compacted, poor soil drain, poor drainage.
Okay, all right. I'm getting the gist. So,
Yeah.
So what I would like to suggest, everyone, is that those are all important things. You're picking up on the traffic there. No, wait, now you're racing ahead. Go back. But
Oh my God.
look at how flat the picture is.
Oh boy.
Back. There we go. Okay. So, I mean, you see how flat the landscape is? And then there's this building. You can see there's new trees, or relatively new trees, right? And if you look in the distance, and I know this is perhaps a little bit, if you were actually there, you could see this better, but can you see how the land is falling off to the left? So there's a slope, okay? And so if you look at this big picture, and I know it's probably not really realistic that you could see this just from looking at the photo rather than being there, but what you would see is that you could see the shape of the grading. So they made this flat place for the building, and then you could see it falling off to the side. And so you could kind of estimate.
Hey, Susan, I don't know if you can hear me, but I seem to be having some issues with your volume. I can't hear you right now. Hold on a second.
Can you hear me now?
I can, but now I also had to unmute everyone else, I believe. No, I think it looks good, actually. So if you happen to be unmuted, please mute yourself.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me now. So I'm not sure what we missed. But in any case, so if you're looking at if you were there, and then maybe from this picture you can see that it's very flat, and you can see the soils falling off to the side. there's a new building, new trees. And so what's happened here is there's been grading and cut and fill, right? And so if you step back from the landscape and really think about this on any site, this is pretty dramatic, but there's almost always cut and fill, unless you live in an extremely flat place, which I know some people do. But even then, there might be cut and fill that might even just be like a foot or something like that. And so that tells you something about what's going on. So I could look at the soil survey, I could see what was here before, and I could estimate, if I step back enough, how far buried the original soil is. So probably the topsoil was removed, and then some of that soil was buried. And so I could estimate how deep the fill might be. And so what's going on here, as you correctly surmised, is that someone put in fill, it was compacted, then they brought in a little topsoil, someone rutted it with the equipment here, but that topsoil isn't draining and it's very shallow. Okay, so that can tell you a lot about what's going on. And so let's just say that we had a little bit of fill and the soil is but the native soil is very well drained. I might find if I have poor drainage, maybe that means I can disrupt some compacted layer and solve that problem. So you kind of have to know what was there before and what's coming after. Julia, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, we have a question here.
All
Alex
right.
is asking, are there maps that we can use to look at individual soil characteristics, soil texture, depth to water table, pH, etc.? It would be nice to see larger scale trends across the landscape without having to read about every individual soil series with Soil Web.
Well, I think that the soil, I think that those things change. Let's just say we're not in an urban site, right? So those soil series, they change, but they don't change that much, I guess. I mean, they're going to be related to each other. So you're going to have some differences. Like, let's say you have, a river. You're going to have something that's different down by the river versus up on the hill. You might have cobblestones in one and not in another, and so forth. So if you're working in an area, you should be able to kind of quickly look at the major soil series in that area, and that's going to give you a pretty big picture, a pretty good picture of what's going on there. And it shouldn't be too complicated. So when you look on a map, I mean, normally you'll find you're dealing with a couple of different soil series at most, in most areas, like maybe 2 or 3 or 4. So once you get to know those soil series a little bit, you're going to have a lot of background information. And so I think if you're working on any site, I mean, the very first thing I would do is try to figure out if you can determine what the soil series there is. Now, in areas that were urbanized a long time ago, it's possible there will be no map. It depends on when land was urbanized. But we are getting these urban series, which are more have the new data, new information. Okay, advance.
Hold on. Related to that, Lori is asking, are phone apps like Soil Web useful? I think you basically just maybe.
I love the phone app for the Soil Web. However, my understanding is that the USDA is not supporting it anymore, and I think it's getting where it's not very functional, which is a pity because it has geolocation. So, but that's my understanding, unless something's changed. So it's great, but this is the next step. Okay, so that just gives you the background, right? But none of that is going to tell you anything about what's happened at a very localized level, right? You have to go measure that. So there's no soil map that's going to tell me how compacted that soil was that we were just looking at, right? So first of all, you have this like mapping and big picture, and then you have to have sort of you have to go in and start poking around, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and develop an actual assessment strategy for your site. Then you would go measure things, and then you make your decisions. Advance. So the next picture is me poking around. Okay, so this is just a soil push tube. I always have it handy with me at all times. And you can also have other kinds of things, like in this case, I have a chaining pin, but you could have, rebar. People use different things to just poke in the ground and look at what's down there. And so, for example, that's what we were doing in that earlier site. Poke that stick in the ground, and you can see that there's only a couple inches of imported topsoil brought in over a compacted layer. So if I were assessing that site, I'm going to say, I guess I need to know how compacted that compacted layer is. And if I looked at the maps and stood back and saw how deep the fill was, I could estimate the depth of that compacted layer. And that's totally going to inform how I might manage it. Okay. All right. So keep going. So that's my dog. His name is Rocket. And this is just a picture of him sniffing. And so the question is, like, can he just like sniff out what's going on underground? Like, we really can't see it, and there isn't any sort of magic way to test it. It's like a puzzle that you have to put together in 3 dimensions. Next, advance. Okay, so this is what we're about. We're trying to figure this out. Advance. So this is a donut shop in Blacksburg, Virginia. That's sort of a local icon, Carol Lee Donuts. Okay, and so let's walk into the donut shop. Advance. So you go into the donut shop. I love this donut shop. I haven't been there in a long time. And you go in, and they've got these trays of donuts, and they have these sprinkles and stuff on them, right? Okay, so you look at the donuts here. Advance. And so those donuts in the tray, they had labels on them, but let's say they didn't have labels on them, like this donut. Okay, so here I'm looking at a donut. Let's go to the next one. So it was easy for me to see on that previous donut that it had peanuts on the top, but like, what about this donut? Like, what is inside this donut? And I would like people to put in the chat if you know what's inside this donut. Like, if you were to break this donut in half, what do you think is, what kind of donut is it?
Somebody's saying cream, cream, cream.
Yes, it's a Bavarian cream.
Custard or cream.
Appreciate that. It's called Bavarian cream, which is, Bavarian cream is, like a custard, right? A custard. And so you're right, like, advance. That's what's inside, right? It's a Bavarian cream. It's got that custard inside. And so, like, so many of you knew that just by seeing the top, right? I mean, there's no way you could know what's under there if you didn't have the experience of this kind of donut and recognize that, like, kind of the shape of it and the fact that it has chocolate on it and there's no hole in it, those were all clues that were telling you what's going on underneath where you can't see. Okay, so next slide. So in soils, it's kind of the same thing. You're like confronted with this surface, but you have to figure out what's going on beneath, right? And so you can use all these clues, like we just talked about how to sort of read the land and look at grading, but there's other kinds of clues that can help you figure it out. And then you have a conjecture, a hypothesis, and then you can take samples and kind of, confirm or reject your hypothesis, so to speak, right? But where you're going to take those samples, what you're going to measure, all of that depends on this kind of having an idea of what might be below, okay? And so, for example, if I were measuring, soil compaction on that filled site, I'm going to have an idea about how deep it might be. It could be very deep, okay? So keep going. Advance. All right, so in this picture, let's say these are pin oaks, okay? And so I could use clues from plants to assess what's going on in the soil. All right, so does anyone want to make a conjecture about what's going on in the soil?
So we have pH issues,
Mm-hmm.
iron.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So, yeah. So everyone's recognizing that the yellow ones, they have high pH. And so a pin oak is an indicator plant in urban settings. So an indicator plant, as you might have learned in your ecology class, is anything that tells you something about the environment just by its presence or the way it looks, okay? And so normally we think of this as being like naturally occurring plants that sort of indicate we're in a certain, we're in a riparian zone, or this is a wetland or something. But in urban settings, indicator plant, it's really much more fundamental than that. It really just tells you, it's something that gives you a clue about what's going on in the environment. So in this case, I know right off the bat that the pH is higher there where those yellow trees are than it is over on the right, okay? And so I would start to, because I have experience with this kind of landscape, just like I had experience, you guys had experience with that donut, right? I could make some thoughts. I would say, it's likely that there is less soil over there by the yellow trees. It's likely that maybe there, the soil is shallower and there's probably a base course of limestone that was used to construct this parking lot, which is in this planting area, okay? Or maybe there's like a manhole or something over there that's elevating the pH. And then I could go up closer and look at it and decide, where I need to test. But I can tell right off the bat from this. And in fact, if you get a lot of experience, you don't even have to test pH, right? I could tell you right off the bat, the pH is probably around 7.8, 8.1 over by those yellow trees, probably in the high 7s, and it's probably in the low 7s on the right there. And so you can get really quite good at this kind of thing, and it tells you where you're going to do your testing. Okay, advance. I'm obviously not going fast enough. I can tell that right away. So I'm going to zoom through the next part so we can take a little break, and then we'll have our next section. Okay, so I'm looking at this site. So what do I learn about this? Okay, so I see that there's cement dropped there. That tells me that there might be pH issues here. I happen to know the limestone. Limestone is the cheap quarry rock in this region, and that's what's constructing the base course in this newly constructed sidewalk. I can tell it's compacted. I can tell it doesn't have very high organic matter from the color. So if I were going to assess this soil, my primary concerns would be soil compaction and pH. So I would test those things, and then I would look at the soil map. I would look at the big picture and try to determine if there'd been a lot of cut or fill perhaps here. And that would give me an idea, if I tested drainage, whether it's something that I could fix or not. Okay, so in this case, this soil is slowly drains, the native soil, but it drains. It doesn't have a high water table. It's not impermeable. It doesn't really have impermeable areas. And there hasn't been a huge amount of grading here. So if this soil is compacted, I would feel confident I could fix the drainage problem in this site. Okay, keep going, advance.
Susan, quick question about the pin oaks. The question by Kathy is, could root damage also cause similar symptoms?
It can, but not on its own. Okay, so in that case, I mean, so it's a good point. There's actually a lot of interaction between soil pH issues, say in pin oaks, and root damage. So what root damage does is it kind of accelerates the problem. And in that case, like if that had been a construction site, that would have been something I would have suspected. But since it's like an established landscape that I knew had not been disturbed since it was built, I didn't really consider that to be an option for that picture. But the question is a good one, because essentially what happens is you have, say, an iron deficiency because the iron is being held very tightly in the soil because the pH is too high, right? So the roots can't extract it. But you'll see over time that if you look at how yellow or chlorotic the leaves are, as the season progresses, they gradually tend to get greener. It's just that the iron moves rather slowly through the plant, and it takes a long time for the plant to extract enough from the soil. And so when you damage the roots, you have less total resource for the plant to extract nutrients from. It can really accelerate that chlorosis. So that's an excellent point. Okay, so moving on. So all these different things, like understanding how plants interact with the environment, like we were just looking at the pin oaks or other kinds of indicator plants, really understanding how soil and roots interact, and we'll talk about that next. Doing your homework about land use history. And so this means actually, you know, it can be reading historical documents. I mean, that can be really interesting in some cases if you're doing a big project in an area that's been developed a long time, or it could just be talking to neighbors. I mean, I'm sure you've all encountered things like this, but you know, I did a project with students, this is years ago, and we went out and looked at this site, and it was for the city, and they were really frustrated why nothing was growing and they couldn't figure it out. And I went and talked to some friends of mine who happened to have lived near that site for many, many years. And they said, oh, well, that used to be the parking lot for the shirtwaist factory or something. My grandmother used to work there. And so we started digging, and we discovered that there was a parking lot, you know, about just, I don't know, 8 inches below the ground, right? So the entire thing was on a parking lot. So it's amazing what you can cover by just uncover by asking questions. Okay, so then poke around in the soil. That means pushing things down, seeing where it gets compacted, where your different layers are, maybe pulling a sample, looking at the soil color. And so all of these things, you're interpreting what's going on. And this is where your experience really comes into play. And one thing I always recommend to my students is, like, if you see someone digging a hole anywhere, take a picture of it, because like that's your chance to see the cream inside the donut, right? And so you've got to take advantage of that, and you'll build up this experience about what's going on below ground. Okay, advance. So I'm just going to breeze through this instead of asking you about it. But just to give you an example, this is a bioretention cell with a tree. That brown leaf scorch there indicates that there's a water problem. There's not enough water. Advance. When I inquire about that site, I determine that it's using one of these blended soils and sort of a bioretention mix, very, very sandy. And so essentially they were irrigating the tree as if it were in what I would call regular soil, you know, like the native soil, but in fact it's drying out much more quickly because it's this special engineered soil for the bioretention cell. So those are the kinds of questions we got to ask. Okay, advance. I think it's going to do advance again, has the animation in there. So same thing here, you know, you got to ask questions. Advance. Okay, what does this tell us? This is a root growing through a sidewalk, and so this tells us that the soil is very compacted, right? And so the roots are kind of forced to the surface. So you can look at things like rooting patterns. There's all kinds of things that tell you what's going on down below ground. Next cell. Next cell. Next slide. Here's another building site. The trees are, I think you went 2 slides ahead, but that's okay. Yeah, this is the finished building. And so the trees are struggling. And if you look at the grading, you can see how this land has been graded. And next slide. And this is what it looked like before, okay? And so actually this was prime farmland soil. I mean, this is really a sad story. This is like a sustainable green building, but they put it on this beautiful field that was prime farmland. They scraped all the soil off and disposed of it or sold it. And then they graded it to direct all the water into a bioretention cell on site. So their efforts to be sustainable actually made this whole site less sustainable. And next slide.
We have a question here by Kathy. She asks, some sites under development have often invited construction companies to dump soil to raise or level the site prior to building. This ends up with random soil types, sometimes with chunks of concrete or other debris, and then it's leveled off and landscaped. So with random soil types and potential junk under the lovely new landscape, what do you recommend for management? Would that soil information be available for the site history?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's like the random soil coming in from who knows where, right? Sometimes you can actually ascertain where soil came from, but usually you can't, right? They're just dumping it and has rubble. I know there was a site near where I used to live, and it had like 40 feet of fill, and I swear there was an entire building in that fill. Like if you dug there, you'd find chunks of concrete and like pieces of buildings and so forth. So really what you end up with there is trying to reconstruct a more functional soil horizon near the surface in that site. I mean, I think that's pretty much what you were left with. And but I think this is, if you have the opportunity, or if you're involved in the planning and the policies and the building permits and stuff, you know, this is the kind of thing that we should be able to prevent from happening. Okay, because like what happened at this site, it's really a travesty, because all of this grading was done in the name of stormwater mitigation, but the existing soil there was one of the best stormwater management systems that you could have, right? And so we kind of put all of our thoughts into the little engineered bioretention cell and kind of forget about the function of the bigger landscape. But that's sort of another story. But I'm going to talk later on about soil profile rebuilding. And that is one thing that I think you can do to help address that situation, because that's something that people are faced with a lot. I mean, the damage is done, then what do you do? So I think, Julia, do you want to advance? We're at the question and answer for the first section, and obviously I am not going fast enough, because I think we actually, for my final two sections, I want to have enough time for them. So how about we just take like 2 minutes for questions, and people can get up and stretch.
I think I basically kept up with most of the questions. I hope there was some comments in addition to the questions, which people are welcome to add to the chat as well, since I believe that's visible to everyone, but the questions are not. So you guys are welcome to do that, but I would say for the sake of time, maybe we should just move forward, since it's already almost 12:30.
Okay, we'll move ahead, advance. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, so I've just kind of touched on all this sort of, you know, putting the puzzle together and trying to understand what's going on. But one thing I think that's really important to understand, not only in interpreting what you're seeing in terms of the plants, but making decisions about what kind of management you might need to do. So that's kind of relates to the last question. And this is just a basic understanding of how roots grow through compacted soil. Like, what are the issues? You know, we hear it's like, oh, well, the oxygen's low, or it's, you know, it's there's not enough organic matter, or, but there's sort of a fundamental physical process that relates to root growth. And so I just want to talk to you about that and kind of try to give a more in-depth explanation. Advance. So you can just advance through the next several slides. So all of these are just pictures of how soil gets compacted. Anywhere we're doing any building, compacted, compacted, compacted. And then go to the next slide. And often you'll see this. So like after all that stuff, you have this this compacted, that yellow layer down there, which is, the compacted subsoil. And then someone brings in some topsoil, or they bring in some sod, or both in this case. And this is what you're left with, right? So you have this compacted area down here where the water's not draining, and this surface soil, and it's just, for trees, it's just not adequate. Like, you have to address this subsoil compaction. Next slide. And so I just want to show you, just emphasize what's happening when you compact soil. So these are some balls of yarn. And I think these are really a great illustration of what a soil aggregate is. So a soil aggregate is like a little clump of mineral particles in the soil, you know, like clays and stuff and organic matter. And so it's kind of the magic in the soil that makes it that so soil can both drain and hold water. You know, it's like the miracle of a really well aggregated, healthy soil is that it has spaces between the balls of yarn for water and air to move, but the balls of yarn hold this like whole microcosm of biological and life and so forth. Whoa, 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 go back. So when you keep going back, so when you compact soil, right, there you go. Stop there, right there. That's the felt. Okay. When you compact soil, it's kind of like turning those balls of yarn into this felt. Okay. It's like all that structure disappears and you just have this kind of uniform mat, and you're not going to have water, air, or roots moving through it. So that's essentially what happens when you compact soil. It gets compressed, you lose your aggregates, and it gets hard, literally like a brick. Advance. I have no idea what that picture is there, advance. Okay, so this is what you typically see in a lot of developed soil, where this is maybe a little exaggerated, but you have this kind of layer here in the middle, which this is Rachel Lehman, she's holding it in her hand. This is the compacted subsoil. This is assuming no grading. And then you have a little topsoil at the top, and we confining the roots to the surface. Okay, so this is the essence of soil compaction. Advance. And what we want to do is we want to get rid of that compacted layer, and I'll talk to you about that in the final section about soil profile rebuilding. But let's get back to how roots respond. So next slide. Okay, so these are some old research pictures of silver maple, and what I want to demonstrate to you with these pictures is that really what roots are responding to in soils is that the physical impediment to growth. Okay, so if you think about it, roots grow because the cells are expanding, and they're expanding because water is being pushed into them. Okay, so it's the turgor pressure. It's like expanding the cell that's pushing the root through the soil. Roots are really good at kind of finding their way around impediments. You know, I'm sure you've all seen roots like turning right angles when they hit a wall or something like that. But when you have compacted soil, fundamentally the soil just gets hard, okay? And so this is what you see. So on the left, we have low soil strength, and that's the measure of how hard the soil is. And you can see these little seedlings, they've all grown in growth chambers for exactly the same amount of time, okay? So you've got these long roots, fibrous, growing out to depth, right? Then the soil gets a little harder in the middle, and the roots are stubbier, they're more branched, more shallow. And then on the high resistance on the right, the roots are really shallow and they're really thickened and stubby, okay? And so thick, stubby, branched, shallow roots, that's what you get when you have soil compaction. And essentially the soil is just too hard for the root to penetrate, okay? So, but what I want to emphasize to you is there's more than one thing that can make the soil hard or soft. So think about like a big lump of clay, like you're gonna make a pot. So you're on your potting wheel and you're throwing the clay down. I mean, that clay's soft, you can manipulate it, right? But when it dries out, before you even put it in the kiln, or if you were making bricks, it's hard, it's completely hard and impenetrable, right? So there's two things that will contribute to the soil strength or the soil hardness. And one of those is how compressed it is, so how compacted, but the other is how wet it is. So next slide. And so this change in like how hard or soft the soil is, the more clay you have, like the more pronounced that change is, right? So if you think about the clay to make the pot or the brick, it's really soft like butter when it's wet, and it's really hard like a brick when it's dry. You take a sandy soil, like let's say you go to the beach. Well, it's like pretty hard when it's dry, and then it's pretty hard when it's wet too, right? So the difference is dependent upon how much clay you have in the soil. And so there's this model that you can use to understand like when roots are going to be able to grow in compacted soil, because you've all seen, like, there are plenty of places where the soil's compacted, yet roots are in there. So how is that happening, right? And so if you think about it as the concept of root growth opportunity, and on the left, this is sort of a graph, we have dry, hard soil, and on the right, we have wet, softer soil, okay? And so what happens is, as you go from dry to wet, in a normal soil, you have root growth opportunity increases, right? Because the soil gets a little softer and it gets wet, because the roots need moisture in order to expand with the turgor pressure, right? So if you have dry soil, the roots aren't growing at all. It doesn't matter how soft or hard the soil is. So you need some moisture. And then if it gets too wet, roots stop growing because they don't have enough oxygen, right? Because it's too saturated. So you have this sort of middle ground when you have the most root growth opportunity. The problem is when you compact the soil, okay, which is the red line here, you lose that opportunity in the middle because the soil doesn't get soft enough to grow into. It's too hard to grow. And then by the time it gets soft enough, it's too wet. Okay, advance. So that's an important factor to understand. Okay, so it's kind of this catch-22. So as the soil gets softer, it's getting wetter, and it's going to be too wet for the roots to grow when the soil's compacted, by the time it's soft enough for the roots to grow. So what's an exception to this? The exception to this is a species that can grow when soil is really wet, right? So that's like bottomland species like elms and silver maples and honey locusts and green ash and all those things that we think of as like tough urban trees, right? So what happens is they get to that point where it's very wet. Now the soil is soft enough for them to grow. And they have more opportunity to grow than, say, a more mesic species, which as soon as the soil gets too wet, it just shuts down. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on in terms of root growth opportunity. And then there's another sort of myth about compaction that I want to discuss, and that is the idea that there's a threshold. So a lot of people will say, hey, you know, how compacted is it? As long as the bulk density is below such and such, I'm not worried about it. But that's really not the way it works. It's like the harder the soil gets, the more restriction there is on root growth, like end of story. So in this graph here, this is the growth of the tree on the left, on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we have the bulk density. And you'll notice how the tree growth, or size in this case, these are all clones, so is decreasing as the bulk density increases, but it's decreasing right at the beginning. Like even when you don't consider this like particularly compacted, like a bulk density is a measure of soil compaction. It's just essentially the weight over the volume. And if you have the 0.9 to 1, I mean, that's really totally uncompacted soil, but you still see a decrease. Okay, so any compaction is going to restrict root growth. So it's not true that there's a threshold. So I think it's important to also understand that. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad. You know, if you have a soil that is healthy and well aggregated and it has a higher density, as long as, you know, you need that to make it stable and to hold water and so forth. But there is no sort of magic threshold. Advance. So when we're thinking about these things and we're thinking about how roots are going to respond to a particular soil environment, you need to know the species. Is it a species that tolerates waterlogged conditions? And you need to know the soil texture. How is it going to respond to moisture? Is it sandy? Is it clay? Okay. And then that is going to help you understand how roots will interact with it. And so my colleague Eric Wiseman took these pictures, which I think are just really funny. They're fantastic. And it's just to emphasize that roots grow where they have, they follow the path of least resistance. Okay, so here's this tree and here's its roots, and it has a little sign. It's like deliveries this way or maintenance. So like which one is the roots which are they going to choose? So I think the roots are going to go for delivery, so advance. So those roots come out, they go around the corner because that's the path of least resistance, advance. And they keep going, advance. They keep going, advance, advance. You can just keep advancing, advance. Like they just keep going, right? And they're following the path of least resistance. And so that is essentially how roots are interacting with compacted soil. Next slide. And you can see that every time you look inside the donut here. So here's someone digging a hole. I see this Freeman maple. See how shallow the root system is. I can see that there's a compacted layer. I can see that there's an old parking lot under there. And you can see how the roots are just confined to the surface because they grow where it's easiest to grow. Next slide. Okay, so this is a pit in the ground, which you can't see underneath at the moment. So if we're trying to diagnose how trees are going to respond, we have to know what is under there. So we might want to know how this site was constructed or make some tests. Okay, next slide. And here's what's under there. And then once we know what's under there, the question would be like, if we were to plant some trees in here, like where would they grow? And so you have to ask yourself questions like, well, what's the texture of that soil in the middle layer? How compacted is it? Does it get wet under here, or is the pavement keeping it completely dry? Okay, and so you will see that, and this is a whole topic for another conversation, but when you look at the way soils are constructed under pavement, if you kind of put this analysis on those conditions, you will see that we often design these pavement sections to encourage roots to grow exactly where we don't want them to grow, which is usually right between the soil, the compacted sublayer, and the base course. And that's the path of least resistance, and we design it so the roots grow there, even though that's unintentional, even though it's often where we don't want them. Okay, next slide. Okay, we have another Q&A break, and then I'm going to talk about when to remediate compacted soils and how to do it, just really briefly.
Okay, so we have a question here by Robert. Will there be any discussion of telltale signs of chemical contamination in soils? Oil would be obvious, but other things will not.
I wasn't going to talk about those at all. However, I think just in general, to answer that question, I mean, most of the telltale signs of soil contamination are land use history things. Like you normally can't see, I mean, sure, you could see some oil. You could see signs of disturbance, but you're not going to be able to see contamination. Like let's say so like I was working on a site, I don't know, a few years ago, and there used to be a dry cleaners there, okay? So if I knew that there was a dry cleaners there, I know I need to go and measure for certain kinds of contaminants, right? And so I think the land use history is really the key there. And there's certain things, like it depends on what you're wondering about. Like for example, if it's lead or something like that, there are very consistent patterns of lead distribution in most cities. Not every city is the same, but there tend to be consistent patterns about that, like near roads, near painted buildings, these kinds of things, near industry.
We have one more question about the image, I believe, that we just saw. The question is by Daniel, and he's asking if a soil sterilant was applied before the pavement was installed.
A soil sterilant? Like something to sterilize it? No. Mm-mm. Yeah, no, it's not. It's actually quite an old road, and you can sort of see that in this picture by the very compacted base course. It was a road that used to not be paved for many years. Okay.
All right, let's continue.
All right, we're cruising along here. I hope everyone's having a good lunch and relaxing. And So the next thing we're going to do is just quick run through of sort of some decision-making things with compacted soil. And I know I'm kind of just touching the highlights a lot of these, so please do jump in if you have questions. Advance. So if you have, let's say you have compacted soil, okay, and it could be in any situation. So you might ask yourself, like, well, gee, how compacted is it? Do I need to be worried? Well, there's these questions about the species and the texture and all that stuff. But there are ways to measure and quantify the soil compaction. And especially if you have policies or standards or guidelines, you might need to have some kind of objective way to measure soil compaction. So next slide. So there's two primary ways that we measure soil compaction. So one is with a penetrometer or something similar, which is what's on the left. And essentially it's a metal rod you stick in the ground and you just see how hard it is to put in there. And you can have a fancy one with a lot of electronics, or you can even just have a metal rod and you're just saying, this is hard to put in. So that measures soil strength, and that is what the roots respond to. But we often don't use that to measure because it's going to give you a different reading depending on how wet the soil is, right? So a more typical measurement is a bulk density hammer. So this is what's on the right. You use this slide hammer to force those little sleeves into the ground, and you extract what's called a, quote, undisturbed soil sample. You shave it to a known volume, you stick it in an oven, you dry it, you weigh it, and you say, okay, this is the dry bulk density. This is the density of this soil. Okay, so advance. So when you're reporting this information and you're trying to make a decision, it's absolutely critical that you recall that it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything at all if you don't know what the soil texture is. I mean, unless it's really extreme. Okay, so you have to know the soil texture. Next slide. So the soil texture, just to refresh your memory, is what we call the particle size distribution of soil. So we have different particle sizes, sand, silt, and clay, and a mineral soil will have different proportions of that, 20% silt, 20% clay, and 60% sand, for example. So that is what tells us the soil texture. That's what texture is. It's a name for a distribution of particle sizes. So if we have let's say we have two different soils and they have the same bulk density, 1.4 grams per centimeter cubed. Now, just to give you a point of reference, like one would be, extremely light. You're not going to typically see that. And the density of an actual soil particle, so if it were like solid rock and there were no air or water, would be 2.65. So it's going to be somewhere in there. So this is 1.4. Next slide. So the answer to this question is, if you had a sandy loam soil, this is not what you would consider a compacted soil at all. Okay, this is kind of a typical bulk density for a healthy sandy loam soil. If it were a silty clay loam, so this is something with a lot finer texture, and you have a bulk density of 1.4, that's a compacted soil, okay? So you have to know what the soil texture is to understand what the meaning of the bulk density is. And so the reason for this is not because of the change in softness that comes with moisture that we talked about earlier. It's simply sort of the physics of soil distribution. So if you think about it, like think about clay particles, like a lot of them are microscopic in size. So if you had, let's say you have a coffee cup and it's full of clay particles, there's lots of space in there because the particles are microscopic, and so there's air and water between every single particle. So it's very, very porous. If you had it full of sand, the sand particles, yes, there's space in between the sand particles, but the bulk of it is actually solid, right? It's solid sand. And so bulk densities of sands tend to be much higher than they are of clays. Next. slide. Advance. Okay, so to help in decision making, I just want to share something with you that is used by the Sustainable Sites Initiative to kind of guide you on whether your soil is compacted enough to take action. And so as we talked about before, like if it's compacted, the more compacted it is, the more it will restrict root growth. But the question that we need to ask ourselves is like, is it bad enough that I need to do something about it? I mean, that's really what we're talking about. So it's not like some magic biological threshold, it's a decision-making threshold. So you might recognize this as the soil textural triangle. And if you haven't seen the soil textural triangle, you're probably, your mind is spinning because it's the most difficult to understand graphic in the universe. But the gist of it is that there's different regions on this triangle that represent different soil textures. Okay, so it's kind of a graph that has three axes: clay, silt, and sand. And so there were some Forest Service scientists back in the 80s that did a study of all these different studies about soil compaction and forestry. And they looked at root growth in soils of different textures at different bulk densities. And they created this sort of triangle with these little isotherms on it. So there's this little line where the blue arrow is pointing in. See how it says 1.4? So what they determined was that when soil bulk density got to 1.4 in that region of the soil textural triangle, which is up where the C is, so this is in the clays, the fine textured soils, that was what they called the root growth limiting bulk density. And so if you're familiar with this graphic, the thing to remember is that if you read that paper, root growth limiting means like there are no roots growing. You know, it's like root growth stopping, probably would have been a better term. And so next slide.
Hi, Susan, just a quick time check. It's about 10 minutes to 1. And if we want to have a few minutes left for questions, if any are remaining, you probably have about 4 or 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm going to have to skip something, but that's fine. Let's go to the next slide and then I'll go right on after that. Okay, so the Sustainable Sites Initiative took that triangle and they just kind of reduced the numbers on those isotherms. So now instead of 1.4, it says 1.3. Okay, and so what they're trying to do with this, and if you're interested in this slide, I can give it to you. So essentially, it's a decision-making aid. So if you have a soil texture that falls in the clay or the silty clay category, and your bulk density is 1.35, for example, then it's over that 1.3, and you might say, you know, maybe I need to do something about this soil compaction. So this is kind of the idea. It's like it's giving you a way to make sort of consistent decisions about soil compaction and whether it needs remediating. Okay, so Julia, can you just advance the slides and I'll all the way to when you get to the thing it says soil profile rebuilding. Just keep going. Keep going. I know there's fun things to talk about here, but stop right here. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk to you in 5 minutes about soil profile rebuilding. If you're interested in this, if you just Google soil profile rebuilding, you'll pull up our website at Virginia Tech that has all kinds of resources about this. But this is a technique for remediating compacted soil that was developed for urban spaces, and it was specifically made to try to set in process the conditions that would accelerate soil aggregate formation over time, so kind of undo the compaction process. It takes a long time for aggregates to form, on the order of 10 to 15 or even 20 years, but if you don't do anything in those situations we looked at and the ones that somebody mentioned, if roots don't grow into those compacted subsoils that you have, they're never really going to change, or they'll change really slowly. You have to get plants in there. And so this technique is intended to kind of accelerate that whole process. So I'm going to quickly show you some examples of it, and I'm going to just run through the technique. So Julia, go ahead and advance. So it's intended to try to rebuild aggregates. Advance. It doesn't fix pH problems. Advance. You can't use it around existing trees because you disturb their roots. Advance. And it's very, very simple. You take compost, and you lay it on the surface of your soil. Advance. You use a subsoiling technique, and this is adapted to use in tight confined spaces, even like medians or even tree pits. And so you go down, and this is where you need to know the full dimensions of what's in your soil. So you have to go down through the compacted layer, okay, so a couple of feet, and you drop it. You're not trying to till it, you're trying to create veins of compost that go down. Advance. You plant something, a shrub, a tree, whatever. Advance. And the reason the trees are part of this treatment is that trees' roots affect soil just as soil affects tree roots. So this is Bryant Scherenbrock's arm, and he is pointing to this black spot in this soil, and that's where a root has come through. And you can see some other ones, right? See how black it is? It's depositing carbon. And so there's a huge, this technique also increases carbon stores in the soil quite dramatically. So the point is you make these veins through the soil of compost, and that's the path of least resistance, and the roots grow down it. And then once the roots are there, they start exuding, they have root exudates, they grow, they die, there's carbon, and you get the carbon and the clay and the motion, and then you start rebuilding the soil. Advance. And just keep going. There's a number of slides here showing, keep going. Advance. It reduces bulk density over time, it improves tree growth. Okay, stop right here. So this is from Arlington, Virginia, and they did an experiment, actually a controlled experiment with this, using soil profile rebuilding or not in some new medians and some street side plantings they have. So the tree on the right is a control tree. So this was sort of their standard practice, which is quite nice. They bring in lots of nice topsoil and so forth. These are scarlet oaks, and this is the one on the left where they did soil profile rebuilding, and this is after only a few years. And so you can see they did it in this very, very tight space, and the change in phenotype is quite dramatic. Advance. And this whole process has implications for stormwater mitigation, carbon sequestration, a bunch of other things. And if you're interested, do Google it and look at the website, because there's plenty of information there. There's a nice article from City Trees from a few years ago that talks about this. But if you are faced with these compacted soil situations, this is a very effective technique for addressing soil compaction and hopefully giving us a more sustainable soil system to support our urban forest. Keep going. I would like to thank all these people, and one more, including you, Julia.
My pleasure.
That's the end. So so now we have 2 minutes left, and so I guess my short little 3 talks thing wasn't quite as short as I anticipated. So, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and also if someone wants to email me or ask me something, that's also fine. My email address is just susan.day@ubc.ca.
Okay, so I know we have some questions about soil types and where they come from and what exactly they mean. I would say for the sake of time, we will skip those. There's a question about a printout of remediation techniques, if you would share that.
Okay, yeah, so for the for soil profile rebuilding, if you go to the soil profile rebuilding website and really just Google it, you will find it. There are specifications there. There's 2 versions, a long one and a short one. that you can just plop right into a contract.
Awesome.
So it has
Let's
all the
see.
details, and it's written up in language that you could use for a no bid contract or a lowest bid situation.
We have Stuart asking about your feelings about structural soil.
My feelings about structural soil. Well, I think structural soils, actually Julie and I did some research on structural soil. It's been quite some time ago. And my feelings is that it is a fantastic tool for certain situations. I do think, having used it in Virginia and New York, I can tell you that, like, if you have a drier climate, it can be a little challenging to establish trees in it. And of course, a natural, healthy soil is the best, right? But structural soil gives you an extra tool that you can use beneath pavement. And there's other ways to do that too. There's vaulted sidewalks, and there's like modular vaulted systems. And so my feeling is we should use all tools at our disposal. And so I don't look at these kinds of questions like, oh, it's good or it's bad, or, you know, you should use it or you shouldn't use it. I think that there's situations where structural soil is a fantastic tool, and I would definitely make use of it. It also has it also holds a lot of water. Julie and I did a stormwater assessment with it, and it could hold like a 4 or 5 inch rainfall. Like, so essentially you could have like a no runoff parking lot. So I think that there are lots of cool things that could be done with it.
Yeah, it seems that for California, it might almost be a disadvantage considering how little rain we have during the growing season.
Yeah, it's dry. And, you know, Qingfu Zhao at UC Davis, he did some installations of structural soil, but also of sort of it wasn't really a structural soil, but it was like a very porous soil made with lava stone. And I think that that's on the Davis campus. So I don't know how that's looking these days, but it should still be there.
I saw another question from Jimmy. It says, similar to soil contamination, will there be any discussion? The answer would be no, given the time, as to the importance of diagnosing pathogens in the soil and soil remediation efforts needed to create a suitable site. Do you have suggestions for quickest low-cost method to assess and overcome such issues in soil mediums, given a likely widespread prevalence in distant urban sites?
Okay, so when it comes to pathogens, it's absolutely critical that you know which pathogen you're talking about, because they're going to be different, you know, and it's going to depend on the life cycle of the pathogen and what your management technique is. I will say a couple of things just sort of in general about that. There's certain kinds of soil-borne pathogens, like say verticillium wilt or something. You know, you can address these by, you know, there's more likely to be an infection if you have poor drainage or a certain species. And in some cases, you just need to manage the pathogen in that way. There are other kinds of pathogens that, you know, may be better managed just by having more biologically active soil. And this isn't really a research area of mine, but I know there's been some progress made in recent years in evaluating the hypothesis of whether, you know, if you have sort of beneficial biological activity in soil, whether that can sort of outcompete some not beneficial biological activity. And I think that in some cases it can, but it's something you have to be careful about. In some cases, I don't think you can get rid of it. You know, I mean, you wouldn't want to sterilize soil. So you can have places where there's just limitations on what you can do.
In the sake of time, I'm going to read out the CEUs for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, since it's cut off on the screen, and everyone is welcome to leave. But if Susan is up for it, I will just continue with the questions until we get kicked out of the system here, if that's cool with everyone. So the CEUs, if you haven't found it in the chat, is WE-21-11. And I will just continue asking questions if that's okay with you, Susan.
Yeah, I'm fine. I'm totally happy to answer questions all day long. And sorry I didn't leave as much gap as I thought I would. So.
Well, you did answer questions along the way as well. So, you know. So there's a question by Matthew. Does adding mulch alone help if it is not feasible to do soil profile rebuilding?
Yeah, so I assume you mean in terms of soil compaction. And the answer is yes, it does. So if you mulch the surface, what happens is you will see quickly over the course of a few years that you will get in the soil beneath the mulch, this is assuming no mixing, it's just sitting on the surface, organic compounds will kind of leach through the mulch and into the soil surface. And so you will have more organic matter in the surface, okay? And so in the surface soils. And organic matter is key to the formation of soil aggregates. So it does help with compaction anytime you can get organic matter into the soil. And so I believe Tom Smiley did a little bit of research on this years ago at Bartlett Lab, and showed some benefit from that. But I think if you just kind of think about how the system works, it can help you make some decisions. So one, if you get organic matter in there, yes, it will very slowly over time help form soil aggregates. But to form soil aggregates, you also need to have movement in the soil, okay? And that's where like breaking it up or root growth or freezing and thawing, these kinds of things can also help. And the other thing to think about is when you mulch the soil, you may also be making it, you're moderating the moisture in the soil where the roots are, as we know. Like that's really one of the reasons we use mulch, right? So you might be getting greater root growth potentially in that soil by having it not dry out as much, or just creating a better temperature or moisture environment for roots. And the more roots you have growing in something, also that will help decompact the soil. That's why the subsoil becomes this problem, because I see in many cases where you have this really compacted subsoil layer, and it's so compacted that no roots are growing in it. And when that happens, it doesn't change much over time. You could dig it up 20 or 30 years later and it just looks the same. And so if you think of the soil as a living thing, you want to kind of bring it back to life. I mean, that sounds sort of, you know, doesn't sound very scientific, but really that's kind of a way of visualizing what really we are doing. You know, that's what the science tells us is needed.
There's a question by Gordon asking, do you need to use a larger volume of structural soil compared to other soil mixes?
So I assume he's asking, you know, like if you're doing something under pavement. So first of all, for those of you who aren't familiar with structural soil, it's gravel, like big hunks of gravel. And there's soil, like, you know, native soil in between, in the big gaps that are between the gravel. And people make it in different ways. I mean, sometimes people use really big rocks, and so you have like a big boulder almost, and then like a big gap. But usually it's more sort of like gravel that's like an inch or two in diameter. And so some people will look at that and they'll say, oh, well, it's only 20% soil, so therefore I must need like 5 times as much. And that's not really like the way soil works. I mean, soil is a media, right? And it has certain characteristics, like it holds a certain amount of water, it holds a certain amount of air, it holds a certain amount of nutrients. And then roots explore volumes that have these resources available at a certain level, right? So it's not as if like if you have fewer resources available, if you think about it this way, like let's say you have like a sandy soil and it has less water and nutrient resources available. It's not like you see trees growing root systems that are like 4 times as large as they would in another kind of soil. So trees kind of experience the volumes that's there, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So do you need more? this kind of gets into the question of what all the pieces are in your soil scenario. So if I had an absolutely finite amount of space, like a box, a true box where no root could ever get out of it, what I would want would be the very best quality soil that would fit in that box. It had the most water and nutrient resources, and that would be like a native, well aggregated soil. So under pavement, though, you need something that's going to hold it up. So that's why you have structural soil, or you might have something like silviculture or vaulted sidewalks, and you put soil in those. Okay, so if I had like truly a finite area, I would want the best quality soil I could get. But I think usually that's not really what you have. Like, you have kind of economic constraints and space constraints, and so I've seen systems where, like in Vancouver, where they're using like silviculture and structural soil. They're using both of them. Like, so they have first they have soil that doesn't need either of those. It's in a pit. Then they might have some silviculture. Then they might have some structural soil. And so they're trying to just kind of assemble the components that they can based on their constraints. And so I hope that answers the question. I really think it's a mistake to think about it as kind of like, oh, I need 10 cubic yards of soil, and if I'm going to have this kind of soil, I'm going to need 12 cubic yards, because really that's not really the way the tree experiences it. And I think another thing to think about when you think about soil volume is that even the really nicest tree pits that we devise in cities, they don't really have adequate soil volume. The roots are getting out of them, so they're going into subsoils, like maybe not a lot of roots, but maybe like one big sinker root is going down, tapping into some water resources, or getting out and escaping this way and that. And I think it's important to kind of think about those things as well when you're constructing your site. It's actually an area I'm kind of interested in, and have been studying on that more recently.
Stu is asking what you think about radial trenching with compost applied around trees.
Well, actually, I did my master's research on radial trenching, or that was one of the things I did my master's research on. So radial trenching is when you have a tree growing in compacted soil, and the idea is that you are going to dig a trench, okay, and you are going to fill it in with some loose material, like either like compost mixed with soil, or loosened soil, or straight compost or something. And originally, back before we had air knives and air spades, the origin of this idea was, well, we want to sever as few roots as possible. So maybe this is a way we can kind of allow a path for roots to kind of grow out away from the trunk without cutting a lot. And so that's why it's radial. It's because you're trying not to cross roots that are coming out. And so it does work. I mean, so in the research I did, we did radial trenching, and the roots just took it like a highway. They just shot right out those radial trenches. However, I think you have to really think about your situation. So if you put a lot of radial trenches where you're severing roots around a more mature tree, you might be cutting off a lot of roots. It just kind of depends on where the roots happen to be and where your trenches happen to be. So I would be cautious about that. I hope that answers that question. Of course, you can do radial trenching now with air knives. That disrupts roots a lot less. However, you do need to realize that even though roots look like they're perfectly intact with an air knife or an air spade, like finer roots can be damaged, and it is species dependent. There is, that has been studied. There's a paper in Hort Science, if you're a research-oriented person, about this topic.
And Stu also asked how you feel about Philip Krall's books.
Well,
somebody's really interested in your feelings.
I don't think there's been a new edition of. I have all of Philip Krall's books, I think. But I don't think there have been any new additions for more than 20 years, unless I'm mistaken. And I think that they are, my recollection, because I haven't read them in a while, is that they are very useful and interesting and informative, and were kind of groundbreaking in terms of understanding urban soils. But I will say in recent years, you know, our understanding of soils and their importance in our urban ecosystem has really evolved and changed. And we look at soils in most cases as we're starting to look at them in more different ways, I guess, if that makes any sense, as part of these systems of like organic matter management and so forth. But, you know, I think his books are great.
And I believe that is all the questions that we had. I hope I didn't miss any. If I did miss any, feel free to email me, julia.gowan@fire.ca.gov, if you have any questions. And with that, I want to thank you, Susan, for coming and taking the time to be with us and answer all our questions. It
You're
was
welcome.
amazing. I loved it.
My pleasure. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. And also, people should feel free to email me if there's something I can help them with. I'm happy to do that. So, okay, bye-bye.
And you're muted.